Good morning. The title of today's lecture is The Civil War from the Battle of Antietam to the Battle of Gettysburg. The Civil War was not going well for the North in the Eastern theater of the war in 1862. Robert E. Lee had repulsed the Army of the Potomac in the first half of the year during the Peninsula Campaign in Virginia. This was that army's attempt to take the city of Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, and end the war. But Lee had repulsed the Army of the Potomac. Then in September of 1862, an emboldened Lee had taken the Army of Northern Virginia, and don't let that title confuse you. This is the most important of the South's armies, the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee had taken his army into Union-held territory in Maryland, hoping to cut off the capital of the Union, and Lincoln would tell you the capital of the country, from the rest of the North. If he were victorious in a major battle, he would decapitate the North and perhaps win the war. The result of this strategy was the Battle of Antietam in September of 1862. It was the single bloodiest day of the war. The two armies essentially fought to a draw, but because he was on northern ground, Lee felt he must retreat back into Virginia. Here was a grand opportunity for General George McClellan's Army of the Potomac to pursue Lee and catch him while he was crossing the Great River and destroy the Army of Northern Virginia and perhaps, and most probably, win the war. But McClellan was timid. It was his great fault. And he too had suffered serious casualties, and he refused to give chase. Lincoln was furious. He fired McClellan for the last time and replaced him with General Ambrose Burnside. The Battle of Fredericksburg. Burnside lacked confidence, but under prompting from General-in-Chief Henry Halleck, he decided to attack Lee at Fredericksburg. Fredericksburg, Virginia, was just across the Rappahannock River. It was December 1862. This was an unfortunate decision, as Robert E. Lee's forces fortified the heights just behind the city. Burnside then had to cross the river, take the town, and then rise up the heights and push Lee off his entrenched positions. This would be a formidable task for any army. Lee and his commanders could see the entire battlefield. And here is an excellent map. You see Burnside's Union soldiers in blue. You see the Blue River there, and the fact that they would have to cross the river, then take the town, and then go up the heights. Could not be more clear than that map presents it. This was a slaughter. One of the worst defeats for the North in the war. Lee's riflemen, especially Longstreet's corps, mowed down the Yankees as they repeatedly tried to ascend the heights. There's no lack of courage amongst the men in blue. The butchery was so intense in many places that Southerners wept as they fired into the Yankees. Lincoln now replaced Burnside with Joe Hooker. You can see in the first half of the war, this is a repeated occurrence. Lincoln giving a general a chance and then changing that general with another and another and another. Chancellorsville. Joe Hooker was the opposite of Burnside. He brimmed with confidence, as well he should. The Army of the Potomac outnumbered Lee's army 2-1, about 125,000 effective soldiers, in the Army of the Potomac due to approximately 60,000 Johnny Rebs, so 2-to-1. But Hooker brought to the battlefield one thing that ensured his defeat: himself. While confident on the outside, his backbone might waver just at the crucial moment, and even his West Point classmates from so many years ago had identified this problem in Hooker's personality. The Battle of Chancellorsville, Virginia, took place near and at some points on the old Fredericksburg battlefield, almost due south of Washington, D.C. Another great battle would take place in the same area in 1864, the Battle of the Wilderness. So this ground was fought over many, many times. As you would expect, the ground between the capital of Washington, D.C. and the capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia. Now, the town of Chancellorsville lay to the west of Fredericksburg a little ways. Both cities were south of the Rappahannock River. Hooker will again have to cross the river to engage Lee. Knowing that a frontal assault on Fredericksburg was suicide, Hooker sent an entire corps north and then west in an effort to flank Lee near Chancellorsville. Meanwhile, another corps under John Sedgwick crossed the river south of Fredericksburg. Lee then, according to this plan, was to be caught between two giant pincers. It was a good plan. Recognizing the danger, Lee now threw away the rules of war. The rules of war. One of those cardinal rules of war is never divide your forces in the face of the enemy, especially if you're not exactly sure where that enemy is. And then, never march across the face of an enemy already in formation, arrayed for battle. In other words, you're facing an enemy, they're facing you, and you decide to turn and march across the face of that enemy, thus exposing your flank to an enemy that's prepared for battle. This is suicide. But Lee had taken Hooker's measure and found him wanting, just as he had found every previous Union commanding general wanting. Lee knew that he could not wait to be crushed by these two giant pincers that were about to catch him in a great vice. So he disengaged Stonewall Jackson's entire corps, and he marched them across the face of General Otis Howard's front, his corps, concealed only by brush and trees and such. And he marched Jackson's corps out to the west and then up to the north a little ways. And then the idea was to fall on Howard's flank. This maneuver took the better part of the day, and so Jackson wasn't prepared to launch that attack until the last hours. Meanwhile, vastly weakened, of course, by Jackson's departure, Lee made a show of strength in front of Hooker, hoping to convince the Union general that greater forces lay in his front than actually did. If Hooker had coordinated an attack at that moment, in these hours, he may well have routed Lee, or at least forced the Confederate commander to send a message to Jackson to return to the main force. But Hooker did not. He sat there. Jackson's attack on Howard went forward. Howard's corps, caught by surprise with this flank attack, retreated in disarray, Jackson himself leading the charge. Unfortunately for the Confederates, upon his return late that night to Confederate lines, Jackson was mistaken by Confederate sentries, pickets, for a Yankee. Several Confederates fired on their own commander. he was struck 3 times by mini balls in the dark. One of the bullets that struck his arm shattered the bone. The limb had to be amputated. Pneumonia set in, and a week later, Jackson died. Now, Jackson was a fervently Christian man. His last words were, "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees." In the 20th century, American novelist Ernest Hemingway used Jackson's words as the title of one of his novels about war. Upon hearing of his good friend's death, the equally Christian Robert E. Lee remarked, "The daring, skill, and energy of the great and good men are now lost to the Confederacy." Indeed, Jackson was the irreplaceable right hand of Robert E. Lee. Some historians have speculated that Jackson's death led to Lee's defeat at Gettysburg, and thus the loss of the war. Hooker, unnerved by what had happened to Howard's corps, retreated across the Rappahannock. Lincoln, quite understandably, was disappointed. He wondered aloud, my God, what will the country say?" He took several weeks to investigate what had happened at Chancellorsville, and ultimately decided that he had to put the steady General George Meade in command of the Army of the Potomac. And Meade will command the Army of the Potomac for the rest of the war. And you're thinking, well, what about Grant? When Grant is placed in command of all of the Union forces, he does not replace Meade as the commander of the Army of the Potomac. Grant does, however, put his headquarters in the field with the Army of the Potomac. Lee decides to invade the North. In June 1863, Robert E. Lee, emboldened by the incredible victory at Chancellorsville, a victory that most Southerners credited to the hand of God and his agent on earth, General Robert E. Lee. Lee now decided to repeat his strategy of September 1862, when he had invaded northern ground. Why did he do this? What happened to the defensive strategy? Lee hoped that a Southern victory on northern soil would inflame the growing anti-war sentiment in the North. The war's not going well. Northerners know this. Men are dying. And so there is an anti-war sentiment growing in the North, and Lee wants to inflame that. Secondly, foreign governments like Britain and France have so far not recognized the South, and he hopes that a victory on northern ground might cause the British government and the French government to recognize as a separate entity, an independent state, the Confederate States of America, and perhaps that would lead to foreign aid, perhaps even foreign soldiers. He also hoped an invasion of the North would alleviate the problem that Southern forces are having out west on the Mississippi River. By this time, General Grant's Union Army has besieged the important Mississippi River city of Vicksburg. Vicksburg was the last city the South maintained control of on the Great River. And so Lee hopes that by invading the North, that will force the Union to bring some of Grant's army back east, thus alleviating the siege of Vicksburg. But that does not happen. The two armies shadowed each other for days. Lee marching north out of Virginia, across Maryland and into Pennsylvania. General Meade chasing the Army of Northern Virginia. Meade's army then is, as I said, shadowing the Confederates, and Meade is in a difficult position. If he races and tries to get ahead of Lee, not knowing exactly where he's headed, he might leave Washington, D.C. exposed. Lee then might reverse course and invade the national capital. But if he doesn't try to get ahead of Lee, where might Lee go? Who is there to stop Lee? So, Meade's dilemma. Eventually, the two armies, though, did, of course, find each other at the town of Gettysburg in southern Pennsylvania. On that day, Southern forces had actually already marched north of the little town. They turned south because they heard that there was a shoe factory in Gettysburg. And at this time, perhaps as many as 1/3 of the Johnny Rebs were marching that June into Pennsylvania without any shoes on their feet. On that first day of battle, the Confederates arrived in great strength and drove the Union forces now south out of town and then up onto a ridge called Cemetery Ridge, a ridge that was just south of the little town of Gettysburg. You can see that very clearly there on this map. And note how the blue Union line looks like a fishhook at both ends. Cemetery Ridge runs north to south, largely along that blue line there. In the night now, after the first day of battle, after the Union forces have been pushed out of Gettysburg and back up onto the high ground of the ridge, both armies arrived in force. These armies are large for their day, and they are strung out over miles and miles of terrain, and so it takes time to get an entire army into a specific place. The next day, the second day of the battle, Lee ordered his favorite strategy, a flank attack. Lee attacked both the Union left and the Union right on day 2 of the battle. Now, on the extreme Union left flank, that is the south, at the bottom of the picture of the maps, there was a small hill called Little Round Top. Southern soldiers had been trying to flank the Union position on Little Round Top for much of the afternoon on day 2. In response, late in the day, the 20th Maine Regiment arrived at the very end of the Union line to reinforce the Union position. The 20th Maine's commander, Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, was told, and this is a quote of his orders, to hold the position at all hazards. In other words, don't retreat. The Southerners repeatedly battered the 20th Maine. Still they held. The Confederates, men from Alabama, tried to get around the flank again. Each time they're moving a little bit further to the east, a little bit further to the north, as they're trying to get around Chamberlain's men on Little Round Top. Chamberlain extended his men still further, though now his line weakened in terms of its depth in order to extend the line. Again, the Alabama men attacked. And again, Chamberlain and his valiant Maine soldiers, now fewer and fewer and running out of ammunition, repulsed the men from Alabama. Chamberlain now could see the Southerners moving still further to his left in an attempt to flank him again. So he extended his line again and then refused the very end of his line, curling it back toward his center to protect the flank of his own line. Now the Alabama men made a furious charge, but it was not enough. The men from Maine cheered as they could see the Alabama soldiers giving up the attack and skedaddling back down the ridge to safety. But Chamberlain now and his resolute men, what were left of them, were running out of ammunition. He realized that he could not withstand another determined attack. So Chamberlain now remembered reading a book on military tactics. And by the way, Chamberlain was a college professor of rhetoric at a college, a significant college called Bowdoin. And having read this book on military tactics, it actually discussed what to do in a situation like this. And so the answer was fix bayonets and charge, not relying upon ammunition, but upon surprise, stunning the enemy into thinking that you were vastly more in numbers than you actually were. After all, what kind of a lunatic would charge if it was only just a few hundred men left now? And Chamberlain is down to not many more than 100 of his soldiers. And so Chamberlain then gathered his officers and explained what he wanted them to do. Spread out, and then when he gives the order, charge down the hill, and the left flank of the Union as they charge down the hill is going to swing, scooping up Confederates as they move towards the center of the line. So it would be like a giant swinging gate coming down the hill and swinging to the right. Having given the order, now the 20th Maine executed Chamberlain's strategy as if they had been practicing for this moment their entire lives. The Confederates did indeed surrender. Chamberlain had saved the Union left late on the second day of the battle. And later, many historians would argue that Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain was the hero of Gettysburg. Fair enough. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain was certainly a hero, but there were many heroes on the battlefield at Gettysburg. The battle was not over. Lee would not retreat. He was sure another attack, this time on the center of the Union lines, would prevail the next day. Lee was counting on Meade reinforcing his flanks once again. In order to do that, you'd have to weaken your center. And then Lee was going to hit Meade in the center. Fighting in the morning of the third day was inconclusive. And here on the map, you can see right there, left center, the 3 arrows indicating Pickett's charge. A calm settled over the battlefield in midday as if the two armies had signed a truce and were breaking for lunch. General Meade's Union Army held the high ground. A mile of open field separated the two foes. You can see Meade on Cemetery Ridge, and I'm sorry for the confusion, but Lee's forces, until this last element of the battle begins, are concealed in the brush, the trees, of another ridge called Seminary Ridge. And so from the two ridges, Cemetery, the Union position being the higher of the two ridges, from these two positions, there is almost a mile of open fields between the two. General Longstreet now rode over to speak with Robert E. Lee. He repeated his advice to the hero of the Confederacy. Longstreet had been against this battle from the beginning. And here, just before what will become known as Pickett's charge, Lee listens to Longstreet as Longstreet tries to persuade Lee not to give this charge, not to make this charge. Longstreet told Lee to disengage from the enemy at Gettysburg, retreat, go back south, back into Maryland, find excellent ground from which to dig in, excellent high ground, and then force Meade to follow, which Meade surely would have done, and then Meade would be the one who would have to attack Lee's entrenched forces on the high ground. And Meade would have to follow because Lee then would be marching towards Washington, D.C. Meade would be compelled not only to follow, but to attack Lee wherever he was. This is Longstreet's tactical and actually strategic advice. But Lee said no. Lee said to Longstreet, He is there, he meaning Meade, is there pointing to Cemetery Ridge, and I'm going to strike him there. This was the great mistake of Robert E. Lee's military career. He had become, after the Battle of Chancellorsville, which was clearly a stroke of genius, he'd become too confident. He'd become too confident in Robert E. Lee. He had become too confident in his Southern soldiers. And now, brimming with this confidence and knowing where Meade was, and almost having won the battle on a couple of occasions and a couple of places in the previous 2 days, Lee says to Longstreet, no, we're going to hit him here. That afternoon, Lee launched a frontal assault covering nearly a mile of open ground from where his forces were on Seminary Ridge, across that open ground to the Union lines atop the higher Cemetery Ridge. General George Pickett and his fresh division, meaning that division had come up late to the battle, had not been engaged in the battle, they're at full strength or pretty close. They were to lead the attack. Pickett's charge became the most famous and forlorn charge in American military history. The men in blue atop the ridge could see the Johnny Rebs coming across that open field. First, Union artillery decimated the advancing Confederate lines. Then, as the boys in gray approached the top of the ridge, 10,000 Union muskets went off virtually at once. The carnage was immediate. The men in blue behind the little stone wall began to chant, "Fredericksburg, Fredericksburg," as they reloaded and fired again. For they remembered, you see, the carnage that the Southern boys had wrought upon the Union forces in similar circumstances at the Battle of Fredericksburg. The Bluecoats would not yield. Reinforcements, including the 20th Maine, cut down the Southerners and sent the Confederates streaming back down the hill. The ridge littered with gray-clad bodies. When it was clear that Pickett had been repulsed, Lee rode out to comfort, to encourage his retreating soldiers. And he said to them in a loud voice, "It is all my fault. It is all my fault." Lee was defeated at Gettysburg, but not broken. Meade was victorious, but he was badly hurt. Casualties had been enormous on both sides. Meade now refused to chase Lee and annihilate his army as it tried to cross the river back into the South. It was a great mistake. Lee's army would survive to fight again, and the war would go on for almost 2 more years. Summary. At the time, Americans of both North and South did not realize that the Battle of Gettysburg was the turning point of the war. But the Northerners realized they had won a great victory, and the Southerners realized they had lost a battle, but they did not think they had lost the war. But in retrospect, we see that the Battle of Gettysburg was in fact the turning point. And even though it was the turning point where the fortunes of war began to favor the North from that time on, it was not decisive. It did not automatically mean that the North was going to win. The South may yet have won, especially if Northern citizens grew tired of the war. Perhaps Lincoln would lose the election of 1864 and a peace candidate would be elected, and the peace candidate then would let the South go and end the war. In that way, the Southerners would emerge victorious. Lincoln, in the Gettysburg Address, which was given on the battlefield of Gettysburg 5 months after the battle had taken place, so November 1863. Lincoln, in that address, reminded Northerners that while they were fighting to preserve the Union, a union based on equality, freedom, and democracy, the Union Lincoln sought to preserve was indeed a union based on equality, one of the two best ideas of our founding fathers, the other one being, of course, freedom. After Lincoln spoke at Gettysburg, the meaning of that one word, equality, began to change to include all people, as before it had included only white men. So the significance of the Gettysburg Address, and I'll talk about this more later, was that Lincoln gradually begins to change the meaning of the word equality to include all Americans and not just white men. Well, I thank you for your kind attention. I pray that God will be with you in faith and grace in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ.